In 1987, Switzerland did something no other country dared to try. The government of Zurich officially sanctioned an open-air drug market in the heart of the city, a place where addicts could buy, sell, and inject heroin without fear of arrest. They called it tolerance. Within 5 years, Platzspitz Park would become known worldwide as Needle Park, a hellscape where up to 2,000 people gathered daily to shoot up in public, where overdoses took place where children used to play, and where Switzerland's HIV infection rate soared to the highest in Western Europe. This is the story of how a desperate policy experiment spiraled into one of the most catastrophic drug policy failures in modern history, and what the world learned from watching it burn. By the early 1980s, Zurich faced a crisis it couldn't ignore. Heroin had flooded Swiss cities, and young people were dying in the streets. The city's response was pure prohibition, aggressive policing, mass arrests, and the constant dispersal of drug users from public spaces. But the crackdown only made things worse. Every time police cleared addicts from one location, they simply moved to another, creating a game of urban whack-a-mole that exhausted resources and solved nothing. By 1987, several hundred people gathered every evening at a riverside stairway locals called the Riviera, openly injecting drugs while police watched helplessly. The frustration went beyond law enforcement. It infected every level of Swiss society. Switzerland, a country renowned for its orderliness and conservative values, suddenly found itself confronting a counterculture movement that united alternative lifestyle advocates, students, and drug users in a visible rejection of traditional authority. The 1975 federal drug law had dramatically increased arrests and registrations of drug users, but injection drug use only continued to grow. The law had even rejected the provision of clean syringes as a public health measure and imposed such onerous licensing requirements on methadone prescription that doctors couldn't respond to the scale of addiction they were witnessing. For years, physicians and social service providers in Zurich had been urging officials to consider alternatives to policing-based approaches. They argued that health interventions could control the harms of drug injection more effectively than arrests ever would. But those arguments fell on deaf ears until the visible crisis became impossible to ignore. The authorities faced an impossible choice: continue a failing war on drugs or try something radically different. What they chose would shock the world and transform Switzerland forever. The decision to open Platzspitz Park as a designated drug zone wasn't idealism, it was surrender dressed as policy. City officials reasoned that if they couldn't eliminate the drug scene, they could at least contain it. Platzspitz seemed ideal, a small park on a spit of land surrounded by 2 converging rivers, easily monitored, away from residential areas. In early 1987, authorities simply stopped arresting people who used drugs there. Word spread through Switzerland's addict population like wildfire. What started as a few hundred users quickly swelled. By 1990, up to 1,000 people per day descended on the park, and the nature of the scene had fundamentally changed. This wasn't just young counterculture rebels anymore. Surveys revealed significant numbers of older working adults and professionals whose heroin dependency had pulled them into this public nightmare. The Swiss Federal Office of Public Health allowed a pioneering group of physicians and social workers to establish medical services directly in the heart of the scene, including the distribution of sterile syringes and needles, a practice explicitly prohibited by Switzerland's 1975 federal drug law. This program, known as ZipAids, would respond to 6,700 overdose episodes in the park, vaccinate thousands for hepatitis B, and distribute about 10 million sterile syringes over its lifetime. The medical team kept meticulous statistics, documenting everything they saw. What those numbers revealed was both the program's limited success and the magnitude of the disaster unfolding around it. Because while ZipAids saved individual lives, the park itself was descending into chaos that no amount of harm reduction could contain. The scenes inside Platzspitz defied comprehension for those who witnessed them. Dealers operated openly, selling heroin to queues of customers in broad daylight. Users injected in groups, often sharing contaminated water and equipment despite the availability of clean supplies. By 1990, surveys showed that 22% of people reached by health services in the Platzspitz were HIV positive, with prevalence exceeding 40% among those who had used drugs for more than 10 years. The park's grounds became littered with thousands of discarded needles. Human waste accumulated in corners. Overdosed bodies lay on the grass while others stepped over them to find their own injection spots. Parents rerouted their children's walks to avoid the park. Businesses near Platzspitz saw customers vanish. The desperation was palpable, the suffering impossible to ignore, yet the policy remained unchanged. Switzerland's HIV crisis was driving the entire experiment, and that crisis was accelerating out of control. In 1986, Switzerland's estimated reported HIV prevalence of about 500 cases per million population was the highest in Western Europe. Switzerland's officially reported 3,252 cases of HIV exceeded by far the next highest, 2,600 in the UK, a much larger country. By 1988-89, half of all new HIV transmissions in Switzerland were linked to injection drug use. Every person interviewed for Columbia University's later analysis cited HIV as the prime motivating factor behind the fundamental revisiting of narcotic drug policy. The disease was prominent in public consciousness, and the Swiss increasingly associated it with the very visible drug problem concentrated at Platzspitz. The park was supposed to enable better health interventions and contain the damage, but it was becoming the epicenter of an epidemic. Then came the realization that changed everything. Platzspitz wasn't containing the problem, it was attracting it from across Switzerland and beyond. Surveys conducted by the medical team indicated that more than half of the young people at the site originally came from rural or semi-rural areas outside the city of Zurich. The park had become a magnet, drawing addicts from across the canton, the country, and eventually neighboring nations. People traveled to Zurich specifically because Platzspitz offered something unavailable elsewhere: a place to use drugs without immediate police intervention, medical services on site, and a ready supply of heroin. What was designed as a local containment strategy had inadvertently created Europe's most accessible heroin market. The irony was crushing. By trying to isolate the drug problem geographically, Zurich had instead advertised its location to every addict within traveling distance. The city that hoped to contain its own crisis had become a destination for everyone else's. The policy had backfired in the worst possible way. Neighboring residents grew increasingly desperate. The spillover effects, crime, desperately ill people in surrounding streets, the ongoing deaths despite medical interventions, made life near the park unbearable. Political pressure mounted. The conservative Swiss People's Party seized on public fear, distributing posters showing knife-wielding thugs with captions blaming leftists and nice guys for increased crime and drugs. The experiment was collapsing under its own contradictions. In 1992, Zurich authorities abruptly closed the Platzspitz to drug users. The decision was swift and final. No phase-out, no transition plan adequate to the scale of displacement. But closing a park doesn't cure addiction. The drug scene simply relocated to the abandoned Letten train station on the Limmat River, reforming almost immediately with all its previous problems intact. The Letten scene would persist until 1995, when authorities closed it too, but by then, Switzerland had learned a brutal lesson. You cannot arrest, disperse, or contain your way out of a drug epidemic. The Platzspitz experiment failed not because harm reduction was wrong in principle, but because it was implemented in isolation, as pure tolerance without treatment infrastructure, as containment without addressing root causes, as a desperate geographic solution to a medical and social crisis that required comprehensive intervention. The damage to the addicts was colossal. Mortality from AIDS among drug users and from overdoses and other causes remained high throughout the Platzspitz era, only beginning to drop precipitously after 1995 when new policies finally took hold. Thousands contracted HIV in those years, infections that could have been prevented under different policies. Families watched loved ones deteriorate in public view. The stigma attached to addiction deepened as Switzerland's park became international news, its images broadcast worldwide as a cautionary tale. Yet, paradoxically, this spectacular failure catalyzed something unexpected, a fundamental rethinking of Swiss drug policy that would eventually produce one of the world's most successful approaches to addiction. The collapse of Needle Park taught Switzerland, and the world, 5 critical lessons that would reshape drug policy for decades to come. Lesson 1. Policy must be guided by rigorous scientific evidence, not desperation. Switzerland's later success came from its willingness to experiment at the border of the law and to be guided by experimental evidence, setting up new programs as scientific studies that could inform policymaking with empirical data. The Platzspitz approach lacked this foundation. It was containment without research design, tolerance without measurement of outcomes beyond immediate health interventions. The Swiss would later become exemplary in their openness of the government and frontline service providers to independent review, producing hundreds of peer-reviewed studies and commissioning external evaluations. This commitment to evidence over ideology became Switzerland's greatest strength. Policy based on feelings of desperation produces disasters like Needle Park. Policy based on data produces sustainable solutions. 2. Harm reduction without comprehensive treatment infrastructure is containment theatre, not healthcare. Platzspitz provided sterile needles and emergency overdose response, but it didn't provide the thing people with severe addiction actually needed: accessible, low-barrier pathways into treatment. Switzerland's later success came from dramatically expanding low-threshold methadone programs. Enrollment went from practically zero in the early 1990s to over 18,000 at their peak in the year 2000, with more than 50% of people with opiate dependency eventually enrolled. The medical professionals who worked at Platzspitz understood this. They advocated for years for treatment expansion. As one observer noted, the persistence of the drug scene seemed to underscore the point that some health and social professionals had been making for some time: the traditional system of drug dependency treatment, which included extended periods of inpatient care, did not seem to respond to the needs of a new generation of street-based drug users. The park demonstrated that harm reduction saves lives in the moment, but without treatment options, it cannot end the cycle. 3. Public health and public order must be addressed together, not traded against each other. The false choice that led to Platzspitz was between aggressive policing that failed to reduce harm and pure tolerance that failed to maintain public safety. Switzerland eventually succeeded by bringing policing and health programs together under a coherent policy rubric, the famous 4 pillars approach of prevention, treatment, harm reduction, and law enforcement. As one Swiss police official later reflected, "Before, we didn't consult each other. The Department of Social Affairs did its work on the ground, then the police came and confiscated from the drug users the needles that had been distributed." Since the creation of the Drug Committee, agencies work closer together, decisions are made in concert, and law enforcement and social affairs pursue one and the same strategy. The lesson wasn't that enforcement should end, but that it must be coordinated with health interventions towards shared goals. Platzspitz failed partly because it abdicated enforcement entirely within the park's boundaries while maintaining it everywhere else, creating a grotesque exception rather than a coherent policy. 4. Geographic containment of addiction is a fantasy when the underlying problem is untreated dependency. The discovery that more than half of Platzspitz users came from outside Zurich shattered the containment theory. Addiction doesn't respect park boundaries. Creating a designated drug zone without simultaneously expanding treatment across the entire region simply concentrates suffering rather than reducing it. Switzerland learned this lesson painfully when closing Platzspitz led immediately to the Letten station scene forming elsewhere. The elaborate effort to repatriate drug users to their towns of origin, which even included a centre where users were detained to await transfer, did not appear to make a dent in the continued visibility of the drug scene. Geography is not destiny, treatment infrastructure is. The solution wasn't better containment, it was making treatment accessible in every community where addiction existed. 5. Public education and democratic accountability are essential for sustaining controversial policies. Switzerland's system of direct democracy meant drug policy had to ultimately satisfy voters, and the Platzspitz disaster poisoned public trust that made later reforms harder to achieve. Yet, Switzerland's investment in popular awareness of drug issues and in sharing the results of program evaluations through both popular and scholarly publications eventually rebuilt that trust. When Switzerland introduced heroin-assisted therapy and expanded methadone programs in the late 1990s, authorities faced fierce opposition and multiple referenda challenging the policies. They prevailed by presenting clear evidence, maintaining transparency, and demonstrating concrete results, things impossible to do when your flagship program is an open-air drug market descending into chaos. In 2008, 68% of Swiss voters endorsed the comprehensive 4 pillars approach, including heroin-assisted therapy, because they could see measurable improvements. New heroin users declined from 850 in 1990 to 150 in 2002. Drug-related deaths fell by more than 50% between 1991 and 2004, and the country witnessed a 90% reduction in property crime committed by drug users. The Platzspitz experiment lasted only 5 years, but its impact echoes through drug policy debates worldwide. Images from Needle Park became anti-harm reduction propaganda, used by prohibitionists to argue that any liberalization leads inevitably to chaos. Yet, Switzerland's story didn't end with Platzspitz's closure. It began there. Switzerland's Needle Park stands as a warning. Desperation makes terrible policy. But it also stands as a beginning, proof that even catastrophic failure can generate the political will for evidence-based transformation. The question isn't whether to try bold approaches to addiction, but whether we're willing to learn from failure and do the hard work of comprehensive, coordinated, evidence-based intervention. Switzerland was. And that made all the difference.